think I might have an entire reaction series where I just talk about environmental messages in 90s children's media, but in the meantime, this video is going to be about pollution. I think when we hear the word pollution, the first image that comes to mind is probably something like this, a black toxic sludge creeping its way through an ecosystem and killing everything that it touches. And there are certainly some examples like that. Oil spills are the obvious one, but a lot of times environmental pollutants are invisible, hard to detect, and their effects are a good deal more subtle. A pollutant is any abiotic agent that can cause an adverse reaction in the ecosystem. This could include invisible chemicals released into the atmosphere like methane and carbon dioxide. It could include excess nutrient runoff from lawns and golf courses and farms. It could include silt and clay particles that were carried into a watershed from further uphill where the hillside lacked the vegetation and roots to hold the soil together, and thus erosion was a problem. It could include chemicals which seeped into the groundwater from a landfill where the liner was improperly installed. We call that leachate. And even some forms of energy can behave as pollutants. So for example, nuclear power plants are usually located nearby a water source, a river, or something like that. And they take some of that water into the nuclear power plant in order to generate steam. Now, the water doesn't leave radioactive. That's not what I'm saying. But when that water is cooled and then released back into the environment, it's still warmer than the water that entered. So you get warm water being pumped back into the ecosystem where it came from. And as I've mentioned before, aquatic creatures are very sensitive to things like temperature, the amount of dissolved oxygen, the pH, all of this. So that warm water can lead to a large number of aquatic animal deaths. When an ecosystem becomes degraded because of the input of heat, we call that thermal pollution. There's also such a thing as noise pollution. You've probably heard your cranky old neighbors screaming about noise pollution every time you throw a small party, but noise pollution is a real thing. If you think about how much sound humans produce, car horns and machinery sounds and people shouting and police sirens and all that, if we place something that's particularly noisy adjacent to a habitat, then it's less likely that the animals in that area are going to utilize the portion of the habitat near that noise source. So less of the habitat becomes usable, and therefore it's become degraded. So sound can actually become a pollutant. On this slide, we have two examples of pollution that I've already mentioned. On the left, we have carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, we're going to talk a lot about later when we talk about climate change biology. But when carbon dioxide increases its concentration in the atmosphere, it also saturates any kind of water source that you have around. Water can hold gases inside of it. You've heard of dissolved oxygen for fish. There's dissolved carbon dioxide as well. You should be familiar with this if you've ever opened up a can of cola. That's carbon dioxide that's dissolved inside that liquid. When you increase the concentration of CO2 dissolved inside water, you get carbonic acid, which is one of the reasons why the ocean is becoming more and more acid over time, which we mentioned when we were talking about coral reefs. On the right, you see a beach with a whole bunch of dead fish washing up on the shore. We've also talked about this phenomenon, and that is nutrient pollution. All of the artificial fertilizers, the phosphates and the nitrates that we put into the soil in all of the farms in Middle America, well, all of those watersheds end up being connected to the Mississippi River watershed, which then dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. So we create this concentrated nutrient burst that flows into the Gulf of Mexico every year, creating a whole bunch of algae. When those algae die, they deplete all of the oxygen that's dissolved inside the water. Cellular respiration uses up oxygen, so as their cells decay, the dissolved oxygen inside the water column depletes, it goes down. And fish need that dissolved oxygen. Fish don't actually breathe water, they breathe the dissolved oxygen inside of the water. If there's no dissolved oxygen, the fish will end up suffocating, and as a result, they wash up dead on the beach. When nutrient pollution causes these massive algae blooms, we call it eutrophication, cultural eutrophication. We are increasing how much algae is inside the water column as a result of our lifestyles. Even when we try our best to dispose of waste properly by putting out with the garbage, putting out with the recycling, sending it to a landfill or recycling center, some of that waste inevitably gets lost from the system and it ends up washed into waterways and delivered over to oceans. Once in the oceans, the currents cycle around and they actually concentrate a lot of our plastic waste into particular locations, which are called gyres. For example, we have something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is an area of the Pacific Ocean which is twice the size of the state of Texas, where there is extremely elevated levels of plastic floating around in the water. And these are also areas where wildlife tend to feed, so large amounts of plastic becomes lodged in the stomachs of whales and turtles and other kinds of organisms. Many of the animals that feed at these gyres migrate around the world, so it's not just a local problem. Pollution in one location can become a worldwide issue. In other words, pollutants released by human activities can have local, regional, and global effects. Some pollutants, such as oil spills, contaminate a limited region, but on the other hand, the global water cycle can transport pollutions like pesticides or herbicides from terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems hundreds of miles away. Pollutants, which are emitted into the atmosphere, such as nitrogen oxides, can be carried many, many miles away from their source before falling back down to Earth in the form of acid precipitation. Ozone depletion in the stratosphere is another example of the global impact of pollution. Ozone is a molecule made of 3 oxygen atoms. O2 is the stuff that we usually breathe, 2 oxygen atoms, but O3 is created in the upper atmosphere when high-energy radiation impacts the O2, creating a thin layer of ozone which has the added benefit of providing protection from ultraviolet radiation for those of us down here on the surface. Beginning in the 1970s, scientists realized that the ozone layer was gradually becoming thinner and thinner and thinner. The consequences of ozone depletion on Earth would be pretty severe, increasing skin cancer and harming crops and natural ecosystems. I mean, we can stay inside and we can put on sunscreen. It wouldn't be pleasant, but we would have options. But natural ecosystems would have no protection from the increase in harmful ultraviolet radiation, especially the phytoplankton that serve as the primary producers in aquatic ecosystems. And if you learned anything from the section on the trophic structure of ecosystems, if you lose the primary producers, there's no energy left for any higher trophic levels, so the entire ecosystem collapses. As it turned out, the ozone depletion was the result of the use of chemicals called CFCs, and we use CFCs in everything. We use them as coolants in air conditioners and refrigerators. We use them in hairspray canisters, any kind of aerosol, spray paint, that sort of stuff had CFCs that were being released. And when these CFCs get into the stratosphere, they can attack the O3 molecules and convert them back over to O2. And a single CFC can stay in the upper atmosphere for a long time, attacking ozone molecule after ozone molecule after ozone molecule, so they can have a very disproportionate effect, considering their relatively tiny concentration in the atmosphere. CFCs were banned internationally by the Montreal Protocol signed in 1987 by a majority of countries. They still are used in some relatively small countries, but not nearly at the level that they were prior to 1987. Since the signing of the Montreal Protocol, ozone depletion has been slowing, and some research has even indicated that the ozone layer might be just starting to recover itself, but it's going to be a few decades before we see any substantial results. I honestly have so much more I'd like to say about pollution, but this is Bio 100 and we're just kind of doing an overview of ecology right now. So I'm going to end this video by showing you just a couple of examples of some extremely polluted locations in the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency is the government organization that is tasked with cleaning up the environment and monitoring pollution output, and they've never really had substantial funding, so the task that's set before them is more or less impossible for them to complete. To show you what I mean, this is a map of Superfund sites in the United States. A Superfund site is a location that has become so polluted that the EPA has to allocate special funding in order to assist with the cleanup efforts. That funding comes from CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, signed into law in the year 1980. The green dots represent areas that have already been cleaned up, closed cases if you like. The yellow dots are the sites that the EPA is currently trying to clean up, and the red dots are the ones that are registered Superfund sites. That is, they are extremely polluted enough to validate using special funds from CERCLA, but that the EPA has not had the time or resources to actually begin cleaning up yet, so they just remain incredibly polluted. And you might notice that there's a certain abundance, shall we say, of red dots in the United States. Now, obviously, we're not going to have time to go through the story of every single one of these sites, so I've just cherry-picked a few examples. On the West Coast, we have a red dot in Orange County, California, at a Texaco oil refinery. The process of refining crude oil into gasoline creates a lot of toxic byproducts. A kind of acidic sludge is formed. And just drilling for oil actually contaminates a lot of mud and soil right around the drill site. You get heavy metals like mercury in the soil, and you get other kinds of nasty hydrocarbons leached into the mud. At this particular Superfund site, 200,000 cubic yards of that contaminated mud and that acidic sludge were dumped into the environment. They reacted together, creating a mixture of different chemicals, some of which included gases, which therefore escaped into the atmosphere. For those of you who are curious how much toxic material 200,000 cubic yards is, it is 40,394,805.2 US liquid gallons. If you are looking for a genuinely depressing experience this weekend, I encourage you to look up the Wikipedia list of all historical oil spills across the planet. It is shockingly long. The second Superfund site that I have selected is a little bit closer to home. In West County, Pennsylvania, at a Blazensky landfill site from 1940 until 1971, they were disposing of all kinds of industrial and municipal wastes in an unlined landfill. A liner is essentially a thin rubber mat which is buried beneath the landfill before we start dumping trash inside in order to catch any liquid waste, any leachate that could get into the groundwater. Wastes disposed of in this landfill included solvents, paints, leaking drums, tank truck contents, and these chemicals contaminated the soil, the surface, and groundwater with hazardous chemicals, and cleanup is still ongoing. Finally, in Commerce Township, Michigan, we have the tale of the radioactive Boy Scout. A kid by the name of David Hahn was working on his nuclear energy merit badge. Now, if you have any familiar with the Boy Scouts, you'll know that nuclear energy merit badge mostly requires you to write reports and study information about how nuclear reactors work, but David wanted to do something that was a little bit more hands-on. David was fascinated by the potential of nuclear power to solve the world's energy crisis, and he resolved to try to build a nuclear reactor in his mom's garden shed. Now, how does a Boy Scout learn how to make a nuclear reactor? Well, step one is to write to a bunch of colleges and universities, to the physics department, and claim to be a professor from another college who's looking for good learning materials for his students, and naturally, professors being such a helpful bunch sent that material right over, no questions asked. But you can't build a nuclear reactor with pamphlets alone, so the step two was to gather a whole bunch of radioactive material. Where does one find radioactive material? Well, David, being a Boy Scout, was extremely resourceful, so he discovered that the mantles used in propane lanterns on camping trips actually contain trace amounts of thorium, so he purchased them in bulk from a supplier, made a homemade crucible, and then burned down those mantles in order to extract the radioactive components. He got more radioactive material by scavenging smoke detectors from around town. Smoke detectors contain a small amount of an element called americium, which is important to their ability to actually do their job. He gathered enough smoke detectors to get a significant quantity of americium in his parents' shed. Next, David went antiquing. Old-style glow-in-the-dark clock hands actually have trace amounts of the element radium inside of them. That's part of the reason why they're able to glow in the dark, because of that energy supplied by the radium. Again, if you want a depressing Wikipedia read, look up the Radium Girls. These were female factory workers who contracted radiation poisoning by painting the hands on such clocks. Using all of these collected radioactive materials and a good deal of aluminum foil and duct tape, he was a Boy Scout after all, David created a neutron emission source, which is an important part of the nuclear reactor. If you'd like to learn how nuclear reactors work, again, you should take my Humans and the Environment course. As the reaction proceeded forward, it became hotter and hotter and hotter, and this began to worry David, who thought that maybe he may have actually made a functioning nuclear reactor, and he realized that he had no way of controlling that. In reality, he probably would have needed somewhere around 1,000 times more nuclear material in order to actually get any kind of reaction going. David decided to end his experiment in the way that you might expect from a 17-year-old boy who has just tried to build a nuclear reactor. He buried it in his parents' backyard. Eventually, local police discovered his dismantled neutron source, and that triggered a response from entities including the FBI, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and of course, the EPA, who designated the backyard as a Superfund site and spent the next few months trying to clean it up. Later that year, David obtained the rank of Eagle Scout, which is a good note to end the story on, since if we go any further, it gets really depressing. The point of all of this is to say that pollution comes in a variety of forms, from sulfur dioxide released from smelting metal ores, to the plastic beads that you find in facial cleansers, to radioactive material stored in someone's garden shed. Pollution is not a problem which only affects coral reefs and tropical rainforests. It is in the air we are breathing right now. It's in the water that we drink. It is in the soil beneath our feet. Pollution is an everywhere problem and an everybody problem. Current EPA regulations mostly focus on how to dispose of waste and what to do once that contamination has already gotten into the environment. Which is why when people ask what they can do in order to help with the pollution problem, typically the answer is reduce, reuse, recycle. But if I'm being fully honest, reduce is the most important one of those three. Making new products requires a lot of material, which means we have to extract that material from natural resources. It requires a lot of energy to refine them and process them, and that means extracting more gas, and even more in order to transport them in order to get to the location where they're going to end up. And they have to be packaged, and that packaging material creates waste, which then can end up in the ocean. Recycling is a wonderful technology, but is far superior to never create the waste in the first place. Therefore, reduction and reuse are the most effective means of limiting the use of natural resources and reducing pollution.